So this is part 2 of the segment on Batman Beyond. And on the first series, or the first part of this series, I customized the head by removing the original and replacing it with one that has an expression. Actually, it's a Mezco head. And then for this segment, what I want to show you is the customized head that I have. Now, obviously I've already completed the process and I placed a photo up on Facebook in one of the groups, and of course somebody started complaining, saying that the head was too small. So let's see the comparison size before we even start this whole project. And the next picture will show you the 3 different heads. Obviously you know the original, and the custom is in the center, and the Mezco on the far right. From what I see, they're pretty much the same size. So if you complain about the head size, your eyes are deceiving you. They're the same size sculpt. Very minimal difference, if any. So let's get started. We want to have the wings in black on one side and red on the inside. And I went ahead and already masked out what I needed. It's just a standard blue frog tape for painters. I did not bring it over the edge because I want the black to come over the edge. I just want the red underneath. So I've already pressed it into the very edges to make sure I get a nice contact from the tape. So we're going to use an airbrush because we want to get a nice even surface. We don't want any paint brush marks from a paintbrush. And of course, I've already plugged in the back of the figure with epoxy sculpt. It's already dry. We're going to use this to grind it down and bring down the edges. And we want to resculpt some of those muscles on the back so it looks like it's actually part of the figure originally. We'll do the best we can. And of course, Tester's paint is what I'll be using for this. This is a flat, as the figure has a flat surface to it. And of course, we're going to be sealing it again with a flat coat as well. This is a primer I'm going to use because I do want that paint to adhere not only to the wings because it's a vinyl, but of course to the body. And this is the acrylic flat clear that I'm going to be using. I'm pretty much at the very last drop of it, and this will be the end of that bottle. So once again, this is the entire setup right here. Airbrush, a couple paints, and I should say a paint that I'm going to use. The black is the only one I'll be using. The clear coat, and of course the primer. So let's get started with this process. First thing we're going to do is change out the bit on the Dremel and start dremeling away at the very edges and contouring the back, sculpting it to make it look like it was originally there. It's not going to be perfect, but we'll do the best we can, and we'll see how it turns out. I'm going to go ahead and speed up the camera or the process because there's really no science to this. The time lapse will show you exactly what I'm doing so that you really don't have to second guess anything here. Just have to be careful not to go any further than the area that is needing to be taken down and remolded. Anything further than that, you're just causing more work for yourself. Once you sand it, you do want to use 2 different grids of paper. I'm using right here an 800 and a 1200 grid because I want it to be as smooth as possible so that the paint dries nice and flat to match the rest of the body. So I've already ahead and finished it off and I sanded it down, and I went ahead and masked out what I don't want to have an excess of paint onto or even primer. As you can see, the surface is nice and glossy because I used that fine grit sandpaper. I did not sand the wings. I only primed them with the primer. So this is the next process, and because it is in acrylic, it is going to give the need to go over with a few coats. You're not going to get it all on the first coat. So just take your time and go in thin coats, one section at a time. Make sure you get all of those edges because that's where you're going to have paint. If you don't apply it on there, you run the risk of the paint peeling away, and then you're just going to be ultimately frustrated and you'll have to redo the process, and you don't want to go back and start everything again. So once you can finish this, make sure you use a hair dryer and cure the primer as best you can before applying the paint, Do not apply the paint while the primer is still fresh. Same thing for the back of the figure. Applying only to the areas needed. Do not overspray onto the front or even on the sides, just in the areas that are going to be needed. And even then, you're going to be seeing some defects that you may have not sanded very well. So the thing to do would be to hair dry it at high heat, let it set for a while, and then come back and resand those portions, and then repeat the process with the primer. So before starting with the actual head sculpt, I want to check my brush and make sure that it is still functioning properly. So I went ahead and unclogged the tip, because that is very common with an airbrush, especially with acrylics, because they do dry when in contact with air. So again, keeping it roughly 2 to 3 inches away from the surface, spraying very lightly, one thin coat at a time, and then using the actual air from the brush, no primer, letting it dry using that air. Once you see the primer becoming tacky or drying, then you hit it again with another layer. So I roughly put in about 4 layers of thin coats of primer, and then I went ahead and finished off on the top of the actual head sculpt. Now this is a resin, although it is, well, it's pretty much sturdy. It is fragile in the sense that you can gouge it very easy. If you sand it, you have to be very careful. Make sure you use fine grit sandpaper, because it will be really difficult to take away any of the thick or deep scratches that might be left by a higher grit, or I should say lower grit sandpaper. So just be very, very careful. In this case, I really didn't have to do anything except drill out the center hole for it to fit on the peg that goes on the neck. So once again, once you finish with your primer, take it to your blow dryer and blast it with some heat and let that cure for an hour or so, and then come back and work on the other portions that you're primering, such as the figure in this case, and then of course the wings. So I applied a second and third layer onto the back. I did go back in before and smooth out some other areas that I didn't like. So I went ahead and hit it again with another layer. And then I did the same with the wings, as you see in a moment, because I do want to have a nice thick coat of primer so that the paint adheres well to this, because the wings are more like a vinyl. And again, my past experience with vinyl is that the paint will flake off if you don't have another barrier for it to adhere to. So the primer is going to be an essential part of painting this process. That way you end up doing the process only one time and not repeating it again. Make sure you get those edges, especially if you want to have nice coverage so it looks like it's pretty much factory fresh. Other than that, you just have to take your time and once again hit it with the blow dryer so that you can have it cure as fast as possible. If you can, let it set for an hour, maybe more, before you come back and actually apply your final paint. So we made it to the paint process, and we loaded up the airbrush with some of the flat black tester's paint. If you don't remember what supplies I acquired for this, you can rewind it back to the front of the video and you'll see the tools and supplies that I used. And this is a tester's paint. Again, it is an acrylic, and you will have to build your layers. Do not think you're going to do it all in one pass. So as you can see, there are some thin spots. I can still see the primer. It doesn't matter because I'm going to go back over it in a moment, and I'm going to get as much as I can on the first layer of paint on all of the edges, all the crevices, all the areas that are hard to see, because in the end it's going to be those small details that are going to make a difference in the final product. So because I'm not painting the other side, I'm able to hold that a round piece that would actually be the large peg that would go into the back, and that's what I'm using to turn it and maneuver the wings from one area to the other. So once again, make sure you check your airbrush for consistency. Make sure that it is spraying properly so it does not spatter. So again, the acrylic does dry on the end of the tip of the needle, so you'll have to clean it out periodically. And with an airbrush and acrylics, it's going to be very common to clean out that tip on a continuous basis. So once again, you see that I have some thin spots, and I'll come back and I'll hit it again. And actually what I'll end up doing is taking it to the hairdryer and making sure that it is fully dry before I come back with some other coats. So I'll leave you with this process. In the meantime, I'll be back in a moment. So now we made it to the actual figure, and I've already heat dried the back, the primer that's on the back, so that's a nice smooth surface. If you want to, you go ahead and sand this with a different grit paper to make it even a smoother finish, but as it is, it's going to work just fine. I went ahead and checked my airbrush one more time because it did clog up on me, and once again, that is very common in airbrushing, especially with acrylics. It will dry on the tip of the needle, which means it will back up the flow and it will cause spattering or just not have any kind of paint coming through. So it is best to clean it before starting and run a little test on a scrap piece of paper. In this case, you see all of my marks on my scrap paper, which I'm using as a drop cloth. So once again, because the paint is completely different than the paint or the plastic itself, it's kind of a semi-shiny surface on the body, and the paint that I'm adding is a total flat black. So that's going to be important to be clear coating it with a clear coat that's going to give it a similar look to the plastic. That way it looks like it's all one piece. Once again, we're going with different thin layers. We don't want everything at once because it'll start running and dripping, and then we'll have marks that we'll have to sand down, and we're starting to we'll end up creating more work for ourselves. So once again, hit it with just the air from the airbrush to dry it down, and then if you really need to, you can go ahead and use the hair dryer once again and hit it with some heat to help that paint cure that much quicker, or just leave it set for another few hours and then come back to it. But because we want to finish this for this video, we're going to speed up the process a little and get everything done. Alright, we're set. Let's remove some of this tape and let's see what our product looks like. And there is going to be a difference in the two paints. So we have not clear coated it yet. We'll get to that in just a moment. Right now I want to see how many mistakes I have on here and if I have to fix anything. And I'm really hoping that it is very minimal. So sometimes you end up doing a good job in the masking, and sometimes you overlook something and you end up having to create or fix a mistake. In this case, it looks pretty darn good. It's really tough to tell. Since I've got this tape here, I'm going to go ahead and cover the emblem because I don't want to have any of the clear coat going onto that and making it flat or opaque or giving it a different texture. So now that I've got that covered, I'm going to take care of the clear coat. Again, even with the clear coat, you want to do it in layers as well. You want to make sure that it goes on nice and even in layers that do not end up running and making it too thick. You want to do that for the wings as well as for the actual figure itself. And once it dries, you can do a little retrofit. But let's move on to the one that's really going to make a big change. And that's the actual head sculpt. So this is one process that takes a really long time. For one, I'm not the greatest at painting portraits. This one is fairly simple because it's very cartoon based, so it's not going to have a lot of detail or shading. It's going to be minimal. I am going to use the 3 colors on it to give it somewhat of a tone on the different surfaces of the cheekbones, etc. Once again, I'm using a airbrush to do this to get a nice even coat, and I'm building the layers. I've already applied the primer, as you can tell. I have a light base flesh tone that I'm applying to this, and on these I'm actually using a different paint just because I like the color and the way it goes on. This is not a tester's paint, it's actually a craft paint, and it actually works out really well when it goes on because it dries flat and it doesn't give you that that shiny surface. It looks more like a skin texture once it's finished. It looks really good. And of course you can hit it with a clear coat to give it a shiny look if you wanted to. I just apply a clear flat clear coat because I don't like shiny faces. So I will be at a distance of 2 to 3 inches. Once again, giving it slight thin coats of paint from left to right and then top to bottom to make sure I get all of the crevices filled in. In this case, I'm not going to be painting the hair with the airbrush. I'm only painting the actual skin, but I want to make sure I get behind the ears, under the chin, anywhere there would be any flesh showing. So now I've changed colors. I've added a little bit more of a orange and a brown, and I mixed those into that light flesh tone in the color cup. Now you can mix your colors in a separate cup and then transfer them over with a brush, or you can use an eyedropper. If you want to use an eyedropper, it's really specific if you want to color match several pieces at one time. That way you know exactly how many drops it took to make a specific color and how many drops of another it took to change that color. But if you're just working on one single item, the eyedropper really isn't going to make a difference as how much paint, unless you have a recipe of a skin tone color that you want to repeat every single time. And of course for that you'll have to write down your recipe, how many drops of what took to get what flesh tone. In this case, I just mixed it in the color cup according to what I see is adequate for this particular portrait. Because it's cartoony, it's not going to have a lot of the detailing that others portraits that I've done. So in this case, once again, I'm only adding the color this time to where it's going to have that shading to still look like a cartoon or an animation. Again, I'm using the air in the brush to dry the paint that's already there before applying a second or third coat. Now I've changed colors again. I've already jumped into a different segment here, and I've added a bit more orange because I want to add a little bit more depth to the eyes and the chin and the cheekbones. And I'm actually spraying from the back, not directly at the cheekbone, but behind the ear, so it causes a slight shadow. And then I'll do the same thing from underneath, so that it looks like there's a shadow underneath. And that's what our finished portrait ends up looking like. It's really hard to tell in here, but I've advanced the process a little bit further just because it's really difficult to show you the close-ups since I'm working by myself. But anyway, you do see now that there are slightly 3 different tones on the face. I've already painted the eyes. I use a magnifying glass to be able to do that just because they're so small, so hard to see. And then once I have the edges done with a nice brush all the way around the skin tone areas, then I come in with the bigger brush as you're seeing here, and I fill in the rest of the gaps because otherwise it would take forever with the fine tip brush. Once again, this is building up layers because it is acrylic. And then once this is done, I'll hit this with another clear coat and make sure that is fully sealed before handling the figure. Retrofit here and see what this looks like. It's fully dry. I got it sealed. It's ready to go. The wings look great. Red on one side, black on the other. The head fits just fine with the hole that I drilled out at the bottom. It's positionable. It works out really good. So once again, let's take a look at that head size and you decide for yourself. Is it really that significant to complain and say that it's too small? Well, I doubt it. I think it looks great. Here it is again, all 3 different heads. And if you look at them, if they're off by a micrometer, it's just really difficult to tell. I like the way it looks. It looks awesome. Here it is. This is the final clip. A little bit of everything in here. It looked really, really good. If you like the video, review it, share it, give me a like, subscribe if you like it, and of course, enjoy customizing your figures.